Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 17 of IGEL Weekly. I'm your host, Andy Whiteside, and I'm traveling back to normal a little bit this week for the first time and doing the podcast and realizing that I'm not overly prepared for the audio quality of it. So I apologize for that ahead of time. Got Chris Feeney with me. Chris, how's it going?
It's going great. Yeah, it feels like summer's coming upon us here. I've seen, to your reference of traveling, we've had some things begin to emerge on the calendar with partner events and other things. So feels like the fog is beginning to lift.
I'm actually out in St. George, Utah at an IT conference. Like a company's actually having a conference, and
Wow.
not surprising it's out here in Utah where things are a little more open and I guess a little different culture, but excited to see what happens today and see people and meet people again. It's been a while.
It's St. George, I want to say Novell, maybe, kind of.
St. George is Vdi, which is formerly Printer Logic.
Yeah, that's right.
Partner of yours.
Are you at their facility, the new one they built?
We'll be in about an hour since we wrap this up. Nice.
Yeah, I've seen photos. It looks really nice.
So one topic to cover with you, and I don't know exactly how this will come off, but we started doing these podcasts 6 months ago, a year ago in some cases. Well, guess what? Citrix now has a podcast. IGEL has a podcast. Mechanics had a podcast before. I guess we should be excited to see other people doing these. I don't know if it was just pure happenstance that they started doing them, but I'm glad to see content getting out there any way it happens.
Once again, Andy Whiteside is a revolutionary on this, out in front as normal, ahead of the pack. So I appreciate you bringing up the idea. It's been a pleasure to do more of these, and I'm excited about the topic today.
Well, I think this goes a long way, and we're going to get better at this as we add marketing people into the XenTegra machine and get the word out even more. And we'll have this content online for months, if not years to come, and people will be able to consume it. This topic today is an interesting one for me because I have a virtual conference with IGEL later in the week, and they asked me to fill out this questionnaire. And the first question in the questionnaire was about digital workspaces versus virtual desktops versus VDI versus lots of management of independent devices and things we're going to talk about here, endpoint management. So I found this topic that we're covering today extremely relevant and timely, and I'm already starting to promote for my salespeople to listen to this because it's really confusing right now as to what people are using and what they're heading for, and people that have had application publishing that went to desktop virtualization, went to VDI, now are heading back to a workspace that has application-centric use cases. It's a little confusing, and I'm not so sure that the vendors aren't trying to make it that way so they can keep selling the products. And but there's certainly some confusion on use cases. So the blog today is from a guy named Ben Ward on your team, I believe, from April 26th of this year, 2021. And the title is, "If I have a VDI solution, do I have a digital workspace?" And you and I are going to talk through that. So can you kind of give me some insight into the introduction here and why Ben's even bringing this topic up?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? So this term digital workspace, I remember hearing the term workspace for the first time, broadly I think it was VMworld a few years back, 2016. I think it was shortly Sanjay Poonen, who had just taken over or had been head of the EUC business there, was presenting the second day and was talking about VM Workspace 1. And this idea, this workspace thing began to emerge more to the point where I was looking at, from a product management perspective, do I change the product name from virtual desktop something to workspace access, something like that, to coincide with this idea that it isn't always about a virtual desktop. There's apps, there's a portal kind of thing concept, right? You go into your portal and access what you need from there. It could be a virtual desktop, it could be a lot of apps, and a lot of that was beginning to emerge with SaaS. And so I think you see a lot of vendors kind of trying to come around that and obviously have a product name that sort of matches. I mean, heck, look how many times Citrix renamed their Zen app stuff, right? I mean, it's now what, virtual apps and desktops. I can't remember all the other names that they've had off, from end to end, but so yeah, I think the general idea here, especially from conversations I've had in the last few weeks, is it doesn't have to be about a virtual desktop all the time. There's a lot that you can do just from a browser and native applications and applications being built to really thrive inside of a browser. So
Chris, you talk about like the Citrix names, right? They've gone from Metaframe. Before Metaframe, it was, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden, but Metaframe, and then Presentation Server, and then Xen App, Xen Desktop, and now Citrix Virtual App and Desktop, Virtual App and Desktop Service, which is all part of a bigger solution with Citrix Workspace. It really is trying to be all-encompassing. The challenge for folks like us on the technical side is sometimes you got to figure out what the right implementation is. And for the past, I don't know, 10 years now, the right implementation has been taking the Microsoft Workspace, AKA the desktop. And I often use the concept of the Internet Explorer integration into the Windows desktop that tried to happen 15 years ago or so as the original advanced or intelligent workspace. But the Windows desktop, that's a workspace. And when people say they have a workspace and they only have VDI, are they right?
No, that they're not right. I think, and I think that's been, as you've seen the emergence of the cloud and migrations of a lot of workspace type things. I mean, how many people over the last 10 years or more ended up working out of Outlook, right? As bad as that can be, and it can be bad when you get crushed with emails, is you find yourself working out of that too often, and you need something that can help you stay focused. And the emergence of a lot of that stuff going to the cloud, where you can access it now just instead of the native client that is usually residing inside of a Windows operating system. Now a lot of that functionality has just been made available through a simple browser, and it's actually pretty darn good. Doesn't have every single feature maybe, but you gotta take time to use it. But I've kind of forced myself at times to work from a browser instead of a Windows desktop, where I'm really comfortable with that, and just say, let's see if I can get a lot of work done just working out of a browser. And
But Chris, if you're that user that uses Outlook or the Windows desktop, and that's where they organize themselves, from their perspective, maybe they don't have the most advanced and modernistic browse solution, but do they have a digital workspace for them?
I would say technically yes. If they're accessing it, I guess define digital. If they're accessing it remotely, technically speaking, that's digital workspace. Would you agree?
Well, I don't know that remote necessarily matters. If I go back to 1978 and I sit down at my desk, my physical desk is my workspace, and then that became the operating system desktop, which is, it's not an accident, they use the same word, and that's been our workspace, whether you were remote or in person, for the last 30 odd years. And so I like to consider that that's been our workspace. Just the question is, was it the workspace that helps us going into the future?
Yeah, I realized when I said that comment, I was thinking in my mind virtual, which how many of us have a laptop that it's physical, it's not virtual, but you can connect to it remotely, sort of virtual, if you will. But yeah, I mean, a digital workspace, we've been using a digital workspace for decades now. It's just this migration to, does it have to always be a virtual workspace in terms of a desktop, or is it more than just that now? And helping customers understand what is the best way to do this going forward for users that are used to this idea that I always have to have a laptop with me. That's the only way I can work. So all that being said, we could probably talk on that for hours, if not weeks, I would have imagined.
Yeah. Well, the main thing I'm getting at there is, as a consultant in the space, it's not my job necessarily to go and tell a customer what a workspace should be for them. It's to understand what they're trying to accomplish and being okay if we iteratively get to the workspace of the future or never, as long as you solve the need for the user, which might still be a Windows virtual desktop, either server-based or quite common these days, a VDI, true Windows 10 one-to-one or one to a few workspace that they land on and get work done from.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was, my wife being a teacher, I've sort of watched her workspace emerge over the last few years. And I've seen some of the challenges, especially in the last year, as they've had to quickly migrate to this remote experience or hybrid, remote as well as in person, but they've latched onto Teams, for example. They don't have virtual desktops. They have, Office 365 or Microsoft 365, and the building blocks that could potentially turn into a completely virtual experience. They haven't gone there yet, but I thought, would that be the best thing for the students, for the teachers? I suspect, like anything, migrating to that type of experience will take obviously training time, understanding if that's really the best option for them, or do they have enough to, just need to optimize what they currently have, which in a lot of cases ends up being the situation.
So Chris, I kind of like what you just said just now, and maybe we should stop and kind of go back and officially define VDI for the sake of this conversation. But like, for example, my internal sales team, we're working on my internal IT team, we're working on a workspace type of environment. But I bet if you go and look at most of my users, whether it's the sales team or other people in the organization, the business office, you'll find that even though they go into a workspace and they have 40 different icons they could click on, they still mostly just click on their virtual desktop. And that's where they go from that first login into what we're calling a workspace internally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that is probably just a lot of people are just, that's what they're used to. I think if we look at the app experience itself, Apple certainly has accelerated that with the ability to have a mobile device that has apps that are very useful, continue to get updated, add more functionality. And I remember seeing, for example, going back to that reference at VMworld, watching a live demo of this workspace, this portal experience where, the user experience it wasn't even working out of a virtual desktop. It was this portal, and then being able to, sign, put in expense reports, approve things, put in an order for, various things, and just all this digital workspace coming out of this portal, and just the idea of changing from this look and feel of a Windows comfort factor to this whole new world, in a sense. And how much would that begin to take? Obviously, the user experience would have to be fantastic, but you're also looking at just how your mind thinks and you're used to it. And so it's been interesting to see how EUC has emerged over the last, 4 or 5 years alone, just in this this change, getting off of that Windows desktop, which I don't think a lot of people have, and just working primarily out of like a portal or just application only.
Well, here's a way to look at it. Think about the number of people who could potentially drive in an autonomous car today that they actually don't use that type of car. They drive themselves, and that's just because we've been driving for 100 years. We like to drive.
I like the handle on the. I like to feel the car, especially. I never forget when I got a rental that had that lane correction.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sitting there driving, I'm going, and all of a sudden I feel like I thought I was doing fine, just staying in the lanes, and I sensed the wheel was correcting itself. I'm like, what the heck's going on? And I didn't realize this thing was turned on, and I didn't even think to even check if that car that I had rented had that feature. But it was a weird thing. I kind of, at one point, I let go of the handle. I just sort of let the car kind of steer itself, and I was like, I don't know if I'm ready for that. And I ended up turning that thing off because I'm just not there. at least
Well, I
not
love what you
yet.
just said. You just summed up what I was trying to say is I don't know that people are ready for a digital workspace, but we know autonomous cars will eventually be very prevalent, just like digital workspaces, which enables more to get done better,
Mhm.
safer, faster, will eventually be prevalent.
Yeah, I had a on this on top of this kind of are we ready for like this intelligence workspace, right? I had a call yesterday or late last week, and then yesterday to kind of follow up. Um, there's this company that's been doing a lot of development work on the Citrix intelligence workspace or intelligent workspace, and getting a chance to see what does that look like, right? Because they were very much focused on not working out of that virtual desktop, even though if the user needed to go there, they would have that option, but really focused on working out of that, in a sense, a browser in this case. But landing on that page where in the middle they've got that column with all their check thing, their task list, whatever. And I think it will come down to the type of job. Can you do your job working out of something like that versus having to go to a Windows desktop?
Yep. So Chris, that's a phenomenal example, and here's why. We have a customer that I got on a call with a couple of weeks ago, and they were working with that exact same company you're talking about. And I interviewed that customer and found out they really weren't looking to go to an intelligent workspace. They had some basic functionality with single sign-on, multi-factor needs that they were trying to accomplish. But because they were working with, I think exactly the company you're talking about, they were being driven toward an intelligent digital workspace, and all the answers were an intelligent digital workspace. And it turns out that the company that was recommending that wasn't listening to what the customer was actually trying to accomplish. They were trying to force what they wanted the customer to have. The customer wasn't ready for an intelligent workspace. They needed something that we've worked on the last 5 years, which is a single sign-on multi-factor experience.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's, I'm going to make a prediction, right? As these, I would say, AI based kind of workspace flows begin to emerge and trying to make things, smarter, whatever, get the user and not necessarily having to go to that Windows desktop to get to stuff. Um, you'll find companies where they're putting out this stuff. Some of it is directly resulting from end user feedback, customer feedback. Here's a problem. How can you solve it? Blah, blah, blah. And then here's a solution. What do you think? Uh, as well as we're going to come out with something that we think is the future. I would say maybe kind of like Steve Jobs is, right? Where, nobody realized they had a problem with music. And then he shows you this really amazing thing. And next thing you know, everybody wants an iPod or an
Right.
iPad or whatever, right? And so it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Will that digital workspace truly emerge and get out of a Windows desktop experience, and make it so productive? And will it be certain industries that lead the way and others
Yeah.
follow? We'll see what happens, obviously.
I think it will. And I'm not saying VMware and Microsoft and Citrix are wrong. I'm just saying it's going to take a while for people to come to the realization that that's what they really needed or wanted. And we as consultants need to make sure we get them there at their own pace, at their own accord, and don't force something on them. A great example, I've got a brother he's a racing guy. He's a gearhead, horsepower. He carried a flip phone for the longest time, and would push back on a smartphone. And then now he has a smartphone and a Tesla. I mean, he just at some point it became his idea, and all of a sudden it was a good idea.
Yeah, that's going to happen for sure. No doubt.
So for the sake of this blog, let's just define VDI as a Windows 10 desktop workspace that we've been kind of living off of and moving people towards really for the past 30 years, whether it was a physical computer or whether it was something you access virtually over some presentation protocol. And then the next section of this blog, it says, what is a digital workspace? You want to walk us through the different options of what a digital workspace is?
Yeah, so it was defined in this blog. Ben did a great job, basically 4 parts, right? So we'll talk, number one, an enterprise app store that you get applications from to any device. So, obviously what comes to mind in many cases would be the Google Play or the Chrome store or Apple's store for sure. Microsoft has a store. You know, so the emergence of those types of things where you can go grab apps for your OS of choice. And then obviously, you know, that user experience has to be based off some identity. I came out of the identity access management world, so I know a lot about that. And, you know, customizing it so you can take your identity and then based on that, everything that you have either purchased or subscribed to or whatever, you know, is available to you. And you can either have it all come at once, whether it's you buy a new iPad and you sign in with your Apple ID and boom, everything just syncs back up, or it's a Chrome OS, you log in and, you know, all the stuff that you had built or accessed in your browser, you know, same type of thing. But I think we're, you know, it had, you know, that true identity, obviously, what are you entitled to? What have you purchased? What do you subscribe to? And then on the corporate comms and notifications, I think uh, that could be certainly, you know, uh, you know, like what we're doing here with Zoom calls or Teams, you know, just back and forth user experience. I think I've been doing a lot more from Teams as I begin to realize what is available in that workspace. Other things that I can add into it, other apps or other things, shortcuts. And, you know, if I can save myself time and I can get the same thing done versus go to my traditional Windows desktop and fire up Excel or whatever, I can, you know, do that workflow, you know, that how many clicks is that? Um, and and then finally, the last piece is unified endpoint management, right? I mean, with all these workspaces, all these operating systems, having something that can be centrally managed um, and certainly give flexibility. I know here at IGEL, we've got folks that really love Macs. Corporate has a policy where you can use a Mac. And if you're not, you have a choice of a sort of a standard image of a virtual of a Windows desktop. You can also run Linux. That's another choice. You can run IGEL. So it hasn't really solidified, but that's coming. I think we'll probably see IGEL move to a virtual workspace in many respects now that we're under new ownership. We'll see, right? Because everything comes with a cost. So
Yeah.
But
So Chris, do you
yeah.
have to have all of these or just one of these to have a digital workspace?
I think technically speaking, it's probably a combination. I think, um, uh, but even if just one of those emerges, that's still digital and a workspace. So, but I think if I'm picking at least two of those, 1 and 2 would be the first two things on that list. The enterprise app store with the device of some kind, and then obviously an identity that is assigned to that would be sort of, I would say, minimum start with that.
Yeah, if I could address these, I would say yes, 1, 2, 3, and 4, or some combination of them. And I would also, and maybe I'm just old school, add the Windows desktop, your Mac desktop, whether it's physical or virtual, still counts as a digital workspace in my world, at least for another 5 or so years. And we'll see how the rest of these things blend into or take over that. So this next section talks about differences between VDI and digital workspace. Maybe this kind of addresses what I'm saying. VDI is Windows focused. Does the limitation to being a Windows-based world kind of preclude it from being a true digital workspace?
That's certainly an argument that's being made. Obviously, with the Windows OS, you have a Windows-based applications. You know, the kind that can either be virtually delivered or imaged down to the machine, whatever. And we're not completely out of that. That won't go away for a while, if at all. You know, but whatever right now we've got, and that's what people have grown up decades worth of experience and that type of thing. I guess what's interesting here, does that qualify with the other 4 points above, you know, an enterprise app store and identity access management? I think there's parts of it. I would say while VDI is Windows focused, technically speaking, it is a digital workspace, but maybe not in the term that they're trying to define in terms of this new way of working outside of just a Windows experience. So
Chris, if I change the title of this section, say VDI or Windows with a HTML5 enabled browser, is that a digital workspace?
certainly can become that hybrid stepping stone, right? If HTML5 would ultimately be the creme de la creme, right? That's all I need, and I can be extremely productive, I would
It may
say.
take me an extra hop. It may not be as intelligent as you want it to be, but does it get me to everything I need to do? I think the answer is probably yes, but you know, it's like the self-driving car, the autonomous car. We know we can do better. We know we can take it to another level. We just may have to go show it and prove it in order to get people to come with us.
Yeah, like I said, I in my daily day, I remote into my Windows laptop. I also have my IGEL device, and I bring up a browser, and I'm connected into M365, and I can access other stuff. You know, and a lot of that is you know, single sign-on in a sense. I authenticate, and you know, I log in. Um, um, but there are days when I need to work from the laptop. You know, I'm in crunch mode, and that's the user experience I'm used to. And slowly but surely, I'll probably peel myself away from just having to work out of a Windows machine all the time.
Yeah.
Um,
So I want to tackle something you just said. I don't think anything talks about the fluidness or what's included in a digital workspace more than the term M365, which you just brought up, which allows me to do SaaS related applications. It allows me to do endpoint management. It allows me to do user persona management. It allows me to use a Windows desktop operating system in multiple places. I came to realization about a week ago that there's folks on my team that didn't know the difference between Office 365 and Microsoft 365. I think if you stop and break down what Microsoft's doing with their licensing and combining all that stuff together in the form of a subscription, it really kind of opens up the Pandora's box of the different things you can do in a digital workspace. And there's no one specific thing that makes a digital workspace that makes other things not a digital workspace if it
yeah,
fits in that license model.
yeah, and to the point in the blog, you know, I agree with this. The Windows desktop was not meant to really be that platform to get you to this SaaS-based portal, right, or access. You know, and to Microsoft's credit, I mean, they've done a tremendous job with adding more functionality, new applications. I mean, just for me in this working from home world, I've spent a lot of time getting into the what we have subscribed to as an organization, and I've found some really cool applications, to the point where as I've got you know, maybe it's Microsoft lists or forms or whatever, and found some really cool use case workflows, and then seeing how all these things can maybe be tied together, to the point where I'm like, I probably need to go and just take a class or something and just learn more about, you know, how can I create a workflow that is seamless? Maybe you just fill out some things, check a couple boxes, and then all of that feeds back into something, you know. And so, but I found uh, getting more used to working out of that Office 365 portal in this case, or Microsoft 365 portal. I think Microsoft is slowly but surely working their way out of a Windows desktop. It'll always be there, right? That's not going away anytime soon. But and now we're looking at Windows 98. What do you got here?
Well, so this is what I brought up earlier. I didn't use the right terms to describe
Yeah.
it, but if you go back to 1998-ish and Microsoft bringing in Internet Explorer into the actual landing screen of Windows, the desktop, to
Mm-hmm.
me, this was the first iteration of trying to have an active, intelligent desktop workspace. I should use the word workspace. To me, this and the Google version of it are the predecessors to what a workspace from these vendors really was all about, which is to bring elements into the landing page, the starting place on a computer, that allowed you to have easy access to things that you might want to go to from there.
Yeah, it was Microsoft's way of getting really connected to the internet, which also began I would say it was also 95, probably 98 was when we started hearing more about, the viruses and this connected world, right? You get on the internet without any protection, and wow, I didn't know that was possible, you know.
Well,
In
and
terms
to be
of,
more specific, and I'm super anal about this term, it's not actually the internet, it's the World Wide Web that you're bringing into your day-to-day by doing this. That's another one I struggle with.
yeah.
People
Well,
calling everything the internet versus what it really is.
right, and this was about maybe, I don't know, 2 years after, I don't know, maybe 2, 3 years after I had kind of gone into the working world and began to see as the companies began to roll these things out, Windows 98 as your standard desktop with internet access, how had that began to change culturally? Um, think about how much lost productivity occurred because now you could get on the internet and read CNN.com or whatever, and I remember taking a trip, what was it? So my wife and I were married in 96, we went to Bermuda, and then about 10, 11, 12 years later, we went back for a work trip, and I was working with the hospital, and I was talking with one of the IT director there, and he said, one of my biggest challenges is the users will come in and they will not be productive because they're bringing up Yahoo and checking email, and I need to figure out how to, lock access down, and but he was seeing this cultural change in terms of his workforce because of that. And so you know that began to emerge as another challenge. So
Well, maybe that's a good way to talk about the promise of the new workspace, which is enabling access to more stuff, but giving you guidance as to what you need to be getting done versus just giving you a kind of a blank screen that, well, giving you a screen that can take you one place that takes you to another place. And next thing you know, you're down a rat hole of not being productive.
yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think this digital workspace where you walk in and you log in and right out of the gate, okay, as a manager, my role, I have to approve these things, or I have to run this report or whatever it is. And it's right there in front of you. Without something like that, kind of bringing it up in the forefront, you're relying on obviously your own, training discipline of having your day planned out. Like I said, oftentimes not trying to work out of email, and next thing you know, 4 hours go by and you're like, oh crud, I didn't get this done, or I'm behind on this. And so I think the word focus comes to mind, right? With digital workspace, it brings a promise of being able to focus and really help you stay as productive as possible without maybe a distraction of that desktop operating system workflow.
Okay, well, this next section talks about identity and access management, which again, going back to my example from the other day, customer was really looking for identity access management integration. They were being forced down the path of workspace intelligence, which is not what they were looking for yet. They will at some point. Help us understand how identity access management plays a major role in providing a functional, more productive workspace experience. And I know from your background, this is, one of the companies you came from did this.
Yeah. Certainly, I think the idea that your corporate identity, a domain account, gives you access to certain, I'll just use the term workspace, whether that's virtual or apps, whatever. But then this idea that there's more than just that now that you're working from, and obviously two-factor authentication began to emerge quite a bit. For me, I started seeing a lot of that in the 2007. It's been around for more than that, but 2007 forward, we started seeing a lot of that being implemented, looked at, and the benefits for many customers, Proxcard in a lot of cases, but I would say maybe 7 years later, we began to see sort of that push token workflow, where it wasn't for the user, they authenticate and then they would get some push token, right? It was easy to just, swipe, accept, or in the case of Apple, they implemented that fingerprint feature. I know Google has it too, but using that as a way to identify yourself and making the user experience such that the security is not getting in the way. It's actually a friendly experience, but it's also bringing what the security teams need. They need to be able to securely identify that user so that they can provide a right access and it doesn't get compromised very easily. And so with the digital workspace, you also have the ability to tie in this federated authentication idea, right? I mean, where you're tying into these SaaS hosted applications from Salesforce and others, and your entry point into those is typically through some type of portal. But
and this is an interesting part of this whole story, because this is better, more secure, while the user gets a better user experience. If done right, this one is the one that's an easy win-win for both sides.
yeah, I mean, if you look, I mean, obviously, pretty much everybody's doing online banking these days, and I've noticed just I've appreciated the banks implementing a two-factor auth, and not just banks, Amazon, pretty much every digital app, the digital shopping site, whatever, right? They offer that option, and usually it's a form of some kind of a SMS, or you could leverage some of these tokens that are free from Microsoft or Google Authenticator or whatever. Even LastPass has an authenticating app, whatever. But knowing that is now the norm and it's accepted too. That's the other thing. It's not so foreign. Users understand the risk, and but they also know that it's a friendly experience in the sense that they're going to get who am I? I'm getting pushed. No, okay, I'll swipe accept or lay my finger down, authenticate, and then and it's fast too. In a lot of cases, it's not like you're waiting time and when is it going to finish. That's also I've noticed is as I use these more and more, the user experience is actually pretty friendly, and so I'm not opposed to using it because it takes too much time.
Let's talk about the last section here. I think, well, we go to licensing, which I think will be interesting, but let's talk about this unified endpoint management. That's something that most people don't think about when they think about digital workspace, but all the big players, Citrix, Microsoft, VMware, and others, they have a unified endpoint management piece of their story because it is a piece of the equation.
Yeah, I think it's this marriage between, I keep going back to this idea between security and convenience. And I saw it in healthcare, and you want the users to be productive. You don't want them getting stopped in their tracks, especially if they're working on complicated health related issues with patients or whatever. But that flexibility, right? I bring my iPhone in or iPad or whatever and use it. And I've seen where organizations try to embrace that, and obviously they got to do some kind of management of it. But if it's a personal device, I mean, that's certainly like, wait a second, like, well, I've got to protect the healthcare network. I don't want to bring your device in, or okay, I'm willing to, but it's going to require this, right? Intune this or something else that, and obviously that that could marry the two together. The personalization factor, yeah, you can bring in whatever you have. I mean, in a sense, IGEL sort of, we're not opposed to that at all. We've got this, UD Pocket. Yeah, bring your device. If the UD Pocket can run off of it, then you can, get that familiar Mac laptop or whatever, and you don't have to worry about messing that up. You can just run off of this Pocket, and when you're done, you just pop it out, and you're back to where you were. And so, but I do think with anything, I remember watching one of our SEs. He was a big Apple person. He gave a presentation. It was really well done. And the biggest issue he brought up was the fact that this iPhone, which was beginning to get accepted, and I love it, it didn't have any enterprise management capabilities at the time. And so we couldn't connect to the corporate Outlook, enterprise. That began to emerge probably a year or so later as that began to get accepted, and obviously the solutions began to get developed. But I think it does come down to choice. If you want to embrace that, consumer experience with these devices, and make it a friendly place to work, that's one of the benefits. Yeah, bring your device. Great. We'll incorporate it in here, or we're going to issue these things, and this is just how it is here. This helps us maintain it. And that workspace that you're embracing with security this or whatever that. Now, as long as it's making your users productive and they're happy, I think that's the other piece too, is you got to find the right balance.
Let's move on to the last section here. I think this is the last section. Yeah, the licensing piece, which I think we touched on with Office 365. And I think the short message here is all these VDI vendors, they have this holistic licensing model that brings in digital workspaces. We've gone through all this. We haven't even talked about Microsoft Teams being part of the workspace story over there, but these licensing packages put together by the various vendors that are key players in this space, if you just look at what those packages include, it kind of tells you what the digital workspace options are.
Yeah, and I'm no licensing expert. I know this, I guess, since VDI is on the table, one of the challenges that emerged in the early years was the Microsoft licensing, especially if you're going to use a non-Windows endpoint to access this virtual desktop, essentially. With something like Citrix and TS Cows, it was pretty straightforward, but it wasn't as straightforward. And Microsoft many called it the VDA tax or VDI tax. And I think we truly saw, because of that, it actually hampered adoption in many cases. There was other things going on too. It was inherently expensive to implement a VDI solution. You saw solutions emerge like hyperconverge that kind of consolidate a lot of those issues into like sort of this, pane of glass type thing. And but with Microsoft fully embracing Azure in the cloud, the licensing has emerged where, now if you've got certain types of M365 licenses, you now have, access to run Windows 7 or Windows WVD in the cloud, giving you a option to migrate to that over time or right away. And so, but don't take my word for it. Read, find out what you're entitled to. I think certainly we've seen Microsoft become more friendly with a non-Windows endpoint accessing a virtual workspace that they offer, especially the Windows virtual workspace. You may, based on what you're currently paying for, be entitled to it, or you may need to make some changes, and if that's where you want to go.
Yeah, for me, the big takeaway here is these licensing packages, bundles include all these magical things, including a workspace landing page, intelligence, potentially SaaS-based application integration, but they all still include VDI or some type of Windows virtual desktop component, or a Linux even desktop component. But they still include the desktop, and probably will for years to come. It goes back to the example we gave earlier that some people are going to drive a car. I'm probably going to drive a car my entire life. The idea that I'm going to rely on a car to get me somewhere that's got all these sensors and technologies in it that's going to safely get me somewhere, probably something I'll never be comfortable with. And so I'm going to be using some form of a Windows desktop probably for another decade or so. And if that's what I think a digital workspace is, then that's okay. It's what I need to get work done, and not what somebody tells me I have to use to get work done.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, and as you were talking, I was just thinking through, in this case, my wife, and watching the technology changes that they've done at that particular school. And when she's not in the midst of just trying to get students classes done and papers graded or whatever, really take some time to think through, how do you work? What do you need to do your day? And get her to think, if she's able to, away from, I need a Windows desktop to work functionally, to this idea of maybe a digital workspace alone is going to help me get my job done, because I access a web browser for grading papers and whatever assignments, and I use Office 365, Microsoft 365, I use Teams, do you truly need a Windows desktop? Because she's thought about a Mac and she's never used a Mac. She's used an Apple iPhone, but slowly emerge and see what happens there, if that will become fully embraced, or if they roll out a virtual desktop, you know, as a temporary measure or an option. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, you roll out a virtual desktop as a temporary measure that might be around 10 years later because people just are used to it. And I think that happens in many cases. They have plans on going to a digital workspace and they land on a virtual desktop running Windows for what is supposed to be 6 months, might end up being 6 years.
yeah.
So,
Well, yeah.
Chris, let's talk about this last part here, which is really the IGEL, which we've totally kind of glossed over IGEL as part of this. The whole point in doing this as part of an IGEL podcast is to point out that IGEL is a read-only managed Linux operating system that when you plug in the appropriate Microsoft tool or Citrix tool or VMware tool, it can do all these things. And it's very flexible and capable as it relates to everything we've talked about here in terms of digital workspaces. And if you think about the user endpoint management piece, it also comes with that part.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly the way we built our solution, it's you could use various analogies. If you're, let's say you go to there's an amusement park, there's all kinds of things at the amusement park that you want to, access. How do you get there? What's the most efficient way? IGEL would be that, in a sense, the van that takes you to the front gates, in a sense, and that's really it, because whether you go to the amusement park and you access your favorite apps or desktops or whatever, maybe a combination of two, IGEL gives you that flexibility. And maybe it's that new ride that's about to open up from Microsoft, or maybe it's Citrix or VMware or some other vendor, maybe Nutanix, whoever. IGEL gives you that platform to still take you there, and you can migrate from one or access them all. And obviously being able to get managed on a central basis to manage the end user experience, no doubt, and then continue to innovate as new things emerge. So,
I like that example, right? Some people, you get a pass to go to the amusement park, and you might ride your favorite old school ride, and that's what you enjoy. It makes your day go by enjoyable. At the same time, there may be other people that have to have that 4D ride, the latest one out there, and they're living on the edge of what the rides are. But in the IGEL world, you got there. Something had to get you there and get you home safely, and make that enjoyable experience enjoyable. And that's a really good way to look at IGEL.
Awesome. Well, thanks, man. It's been a pleasure as always. Enjoy the conference.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate you joining. That was a good conversation, and I'll share it. And if you can share it with your team, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I'll let Ben know we talked about it.
All right. Thank you. Have a good
All right,
rest
see
of your
you.
day.
Take care.